prayer to it as an icon, and ungodly payment for indulgences. And Calvinists would have argued that the commissioners, Jos Weet and Elizabeth Borlug, were essentially trying to bribe their way into heaven by paying for this incredibly expensive altarpiece in exchange for the fast track through the pearly gates. So to the Calvinists, they determined that this work had to be destroyed. I want you to imagine, if you will, 19th of August, 1566. And when I mention this, I can also mention that art history books often have typos, and mine is no exception. It says it's April 1566 in the book, and it's actually August, which will be corrected for the second edition. So if any of you have it already, you'll have a very valuable first edition with errata. 19th of August, 1567. Inside the Cathedral of St. Bavo in Ghent, there are Calvinists who have been rioting for several days. The Catholics who had been in charge of the city of Ghent have lost control, and the Calvinists are running amok. The idea of rioting Calvinists always sounds funny to me, but there you go. They were destroying everything they could get their hands on. Here's an engraving of rioting Calvinists in Ghent. They would try to destroy art in Catholic churches in particular. And the Catholics were aware of this, and they actually set up a bodyguard inside the cathedral, a group of knights who were planning to defend with their lives the Ghent altarpiece, which was already the most famous painting in Northern Europe and was the most famous object of the city of Ghent, the object of pride for the whole region. And they locked the doors to the cathedral and stood waiting inside the cathedral at night. You can imagine with no lights on, sounds of the riots going on outside. The rioting Calvinists actually got hold of a lot of the church art in other churches. They burned it in bonfires outside in the square in front of St. Bavo. They tried to get into the church that night, but the doors were barred and they didn't have a battering ram. But you can imagine them banging on the doors and the knights waiting inside with their hands on their sword hilts, very nervous because they would have been far outnumbered. So the Calvinists tried to get in, but they failed to do so. But the guards thought that they might be back. So the next day, they had a plan that they thought might save the altarpiece. They set up inside the church once more, and according to their fears, the night of the 20th of August, 1566, Calvinist riders came back, this time with a tree trunk that they had strapped with ropes to act as a battering ram, and they smashed through the locked door of the cathedral. They ran inside, they ran straight to the Weet chapel, which is where the Ghent altarpiece was held, and they got there and the altarpiece was missing. And either they didn't have the wherewithal to search it out, or they thought maybe this was a divine act meant to preserve it, but they destroyed everything else that they could get their hands on, but they couldn't find the Ghent altarpiece. And the riots subsided the next day. Eventually the Catholics seized control once more, and what the rioters never realized was the altarpiece was actually hiding only a few meters away from where they had stood. It had been disassembled by the bodyguard of knights and put up at the top of the church bell tower. And the bell tower was locked, and the knights were standing inside the stairwell, hoping very much that they didn't think to check that door, which they didn't, and for that reason, the Ghent altarpiece survived. And it's one of the many near misses, this almost destruction by iconoclasts because of what the work symbolized. And the concept of iconoclasm versus vandalism is the idea of defacing or destroying something because of what that symbolizes to you. And in this case, it embodied Catholicism to the Calvinists. Eventually, the Catholics seized control once more, but this event demonstrates the symbolic power of an inanimate object to become, in the eyes of the aggressors, the whipping boy for ideological cause. The destruction of this one object satisfies the urge to destroy an idea or belief system. The Ghent altarpiece had harmed no one, but it came to represent Catholicism and narrowly survived the attack. Other artworks have been less fortunate, and even today you might draw a parallel to the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan, which were destroyed by the Taliban, or even to US soldiers tearing down statues of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. It's another version of iconoclasm. If you can't actually destroy the individual person, you destroy the elements, the physical manifestations of their power that you do have control over. And the next episode was in 1781. This saw the visit of Emperor Franz Joseph II of Bohemia and Hungary to the Cathedral of St. Bavo in Ghent, which was part of the Habsburg Empire at this time. The Enlightenment Emperor, the patron of Mozart and Beethoven, ruled through philosophical principles, namely that reason should take precedence over all, and that art's purpose was to ennoble man. Although no iconoclast, the emperor found the nude figures of Adam and Eve on the wing panels of the altarpiece to be far too realistic, showing humans with an unattractive degree of naturalism. While the idealized Greek nudes had been acceptable, Van Eyck's hairy and uncomely figures were simply too real. The city officials, not wishing to offend his sensibilities, removed the panels containing Adam and Eve and stored them in the cathedral archives. This was the first time that the Ghent altarpiece became subject to censorship, and it would not be the last. And as late as 1863, replacement panels were painted with Adam and Eve covered in bearskin garments that covered up all the naughty bits. And you may have actually seen this if you studied art history with a slightly older textbook. That is the image of the complete altarpiece you may have had, in fact, with the bearskin covered Adam and Eve in place. During the French Revolution and Napoleonic eras, art looting became standard practice for victorious armies. But it was not only the armies that benefited. One of Napoleon's officers in charge of art plunder, called Citizen Vicave, took so many prints and drawings for himself that upon his death, after having sold most of what he stole, he still had 11,000 artworks to bequeath to his hometown of Lille. And he was one of the members of Napoleon's art looting unit, and Napoleon was the first general to have a specific military unit dedicated to looting works of art. Art had, of course, been looted before, but now they had professionals whose job it was to loot the works. And you see, we're a little bit too big for the slide, but I just wanted to read you some of the important touchstones in the history of looting art during war, arting loot during war. Because this would be very important in the First World War, and of course most famously in the Second World War. And the moment to look to first was actually in 1794, French troops captured the city of Ghent, and they stole the 4 central panels of the altarpiece, so everything except the 2 wings. And they sent them to the Louvre, which had been recently converted from the royal palace into a museum for the French people. The first director of the Louvre, Dominique Vivant-Denon, wanted the Ghent altarpiece as the centerpiece of the museum's collection, a museum that was filled almost entirely by the spoils of Napoleon's systematic art looting. And Denon had the French royal collections, which became the core of the Louvre, but it was also had wish lists of art that he would encourage Napoleon to steal when he was conquering territories as far-flung as Egypt. And he took many works of art from what at that time was called the Austrian Netherlands, from Flanders and the Netherlands. But the soldiers made a mistake when they took only the central panels, and it's not clear why they didn't also take the wings. The director of the newly established Louvre began negotiations immediately with the city of Ghent to obtain the missing panels, because he was dismayed that the troops had only stolen a portion of what he was after. He offered to exchange Rubens' paintings, also a Belgian artist, for the wings, but Ghent refused to part with the remnants of their city's greatest treasure. And one of the through lines for this book is how this one monumental artwork began as the emblem of one artist, began as the symbol of the city of Ghent, and gradually expanded to represent Flanders and eventually the country of Belgium when it grew up in the 1860s. And the centerpiece, the sort of fraying rope in this tug of war between the many nations that went to war across the territory of what's now Flanders, which has unfortunately been the battleground of Europe for many centuries now. So historically, very important is the Modena Armistice signed 17th of May, 1796, because this is the first official document that set the precedent that you could steal art as part of the peace treaty requirements. If you want Napoleon to stop shooting at you, you have to give him your art. And it says, and I quote, the Duke of Modena undertakes to hand over 20 pictures. They will be selected by commissioners sent for that purpose from among the pictures in his gallery and realm. And the people choosing this was Napoleon's art theft unit, But of course, they took things for themselves. Their